welcome everyone to the last of our, what was the name of our series? Beyond the Campus Alumni Stories. And it has been, yes, the last of the Beyond the Campus Alumni Stories for this academic year, that is. And it has been such a pleasure for Dean Melkonian, Dr. Hasbi Khalapian, and myself to organize the series and to listen to all the amazing work that our alumni have been talking about so passionately. Today we're hosting Huri Pilibosyan, and I'll be reading from her official bio a little bit. And in her official bio it says that Huri is a photographer and a researcher. She recently completed her MA in social anthropology with distinction at Goldsmiths University of London. Prior to that, Huri earned a BA in English and Communications from AUA. Currently, she's working on a handful of interdisciplinary research projects, both here in Armenia and in the diaspora. In her official bio that was circulating online, it says that Huri has been a teaching associate for numerous courses at AUA. And what it didn't say is that she has been a TA in the courses that I teach here. And that she was in the very first cohort of oral history I taught. And since that very moment in time, she has been my comrade in arms in mischief making in all things oral history. She's been instrumental in organizing and curating our annual Storying Lives Narrating Histories exhibition. She has mentored so many of my capstone students who use oral history as a methodology in their research projects. And she's been a driving force, she is a driving force in the upcoming Oral History Fest we're planning for early next term. Stay tuned for that one. But now, it's finally time to hear about the narratives she's woven, listening to Subhiyeh stories. Huri, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Atarian, for that. Also, thank you, Dean Melkonian and Dr. Hasmi Khalapian and the Beyond Campus Alumni Stories for this opportunity. My list of thank yous is very long. I'm just going to cut it short to thanking my family who are here today. I want to thank Hosep Markaryan, who meticulously copy-edited every single word of my dissertation. And lastly, I want to circulate back to Dr. Melissa Bilal and Dr. Huri Gattarian, who've always been there for me, and for creating this mutual admiration society that you've just seen, and for their sisterhood and love. Their unconditional love and support that started on this very campus have literally traveled with me beyond campus. So thank you. Okay, so I want to go back to spring 2018, where the core of this started in the oral history class here at AUA, where I learned that it's not an interview, it's all about the process. Then, my oral history-based capstone was an ultimate test, during which I went back to Aleppo for the first time in 7 years. This was in 2019. My mother was also part of this journey as well. It was the most challenging thing I had to do, and it shifted my life and situated me in a place where I started not only to better understand oral history as a methodology, but it made me appreciate its power. Now, let me start from the beginning. I was a shy child, especially around people I did not know. I talked a lot whenever I felt comfortable, but mostly I was a silent observer. Being a quiet child gave me some sort of a credibility. My family rarely worried about where I was in the house because they knew I was not in trouble. My mother worked, which left my grandmother in charge of my supervision. And my grandmother always had neighbors for morning coffee. Not being allowed to take part in those coffee sessions, I would hide under the dining table to quench my curiosity. For a 6-year-old, however, the discussions that took place there were very complicated and out of reach. So I would open my drawing book and write whatever words I knew how to spell. I thought one day when I'm older, I would understand the meaning of these coffee sessions called Subhiyeh. What is a Subhiyeh? Subhiyeh literally translates to morning, but ritualistically it has a different connotation. A Subhiyeh can be defined as a morning gathering of women who in most cases live in the same building. These gatherings often take place before noon, a time where husbands go to work and children are at school, leaving enough time for women to return home and prepare lunch for their families. Unmarried women are also part of the Subhiyeh, where in most cases they would not have time-related restrictions if they live with their parents or alone. The visiting patterns of Subhiyahs are predetermined by the dynamics of each building or sometimes neighborhood. Some buildings have fixed house where women gather. Usually it's the largest apartment in a building or a household that has the least occupants. Some buildings also alternate apartments. In this case, there would be morning communication through a phone call, shouting from balconies, or sending a text message on a WhatsApp group as to where the Subhiyeh would take place. The dress code is housewear or pajamas, slippers, and in the winter, a robe would be added. Since the gathering does not require women to leave their buildings, they do not wear makeup or do their hair. They just grab their cell phones and keys and head to the Subhiyeh. I was born in Aleppo in the mid-90s, and being born into a Christian family automatically labels me as one, even though I do not identify as Christian. My family's religious beliefs, my dual Armenian and Syriac ethnic background, and the neighborhoods I lived and spent my time in all attach a Christian label to me. This would also predetermine my access to Subhiyahs. To give you an idea about the city, most of Aleppo's population since the early 20th century has predominantly been Sunni Muslims. However, Syria's second largest city has always been multi-religious and multi-ethnic in population, having Sunni Muslims, Christians including Orthodox, Catholic, Apostolic, Protestant, Jews, Yazidis, Ismailis, and Druze, in addition to ethnic groups including Arab, Kurds, Armenians, Assyrians, Circassians, Greeks, Turkmens, and Chechens. Throughout the years, the city also welcomed different migrant waves, including thousands of Armenians and Assyrians who found refuge in it in the aftermath of the genocide between 1915 and 1922, and later Palestinians and Iraqis. My fieldwork took place in neighborhoods highly populated by Christians of different sects. Al-Syrian neighborhood is mainly populated by Assyrian Catholic and Orthodox Christians who lived there since the neighborhood's establishment or moved to Al-Syrian in the 1950s from northeast Syria for socio-economic reasons. In the early 20th century, a large number of Armenian refugees settled in the Suleymaniye neighborhood established in the 1300s and set up businesses there. In the 1860s, on the other hand, land purchase rapidly turned Al-Aziziyeh neighborhood into a Christian-populated area, following its transition from a deserted area into an industrial zone in the mid-1800s. Al-Aziziyeh has a significant number of churches, Christian-led schools, community centers, sports clubs, in addition to being known as a shopping district. In the early 2000s, cafes and restaurants started to pop up across the neighborhood, making it into the city center of Aleppo. In Orientalism, Edward Said writes about how the field a researcher works with or within is discussed in academic writing. An Orientalist approach to the geographical location dismisses certain positionality aspects and subdivisions of the field. It tends to rule out certain segments of society and instead focuses more on stereotypes created around the geography they are working with or within. Therefore, I have taken into careful consideration how my positionality affects the areas I worked in and how I discuss them in my work. I intentionally chose not to refer to Aleppo or Syria as the Middle East, the Arab world, the Arab region, or any other Orientalist term in this work. It is also crucial to mention that I do not drink coffee at all. Naturally, women hosting me were asking how I would like my coffee, no one assuming otherwise. When I would inevitably say, "No, thank you, I don't drink coffee," they would ask if I would prefer instant coffee, or what we call Nescafe instead. This insistence has to do with drinking coffee being a rite of passage to adulthood and a ticket to be allowed into Subhiyehs. Having coffee at a Subhiyeh is ritualistic. In those gatherings, as an exception, I had water, tea, homemade juice, which brings forward the argument that coffee is the key word to start a Subhiyeh. A day before my fieldwork starts, I start packing to head to Aleppo. I pack a bag full of recording equipment, microphones, cameras, lighting equipment, and a tripod. As a trained oral historian, I have been down this road before. I arrive in Aleppo. The people I will interview already know why I am there. My phone starts ringing non-stop. Calls from my interviewees asking when I will meet with them. Living away from Aleppo for 10 years, at this point I am still wrapping my head around the fact that I am here, in my hometown. I set up my first interview for the next day because I only have 2 weeks to interview around 15 people. The next morning, I drag my bag full of equipment from the hotel to my old neighbor Celine's house for the interview. People look at me suspiciously, wondering who is this stranger and what is she doing here. As my mother and I climb up the stairs of the building, residents start opening the little windows on their apartment doors to check the unusual activity in the building. The war intensified this habit in the past decade. People check who's coming in and out of the building for both out of curiosity and for security reasons. I set up my equipment and then I take out a printed copy of my consent form and my laptop to read the interview questions. Celine gives me a weird look, but plays along with me. I start recording, I ask my questions, and in less than 20 minutes, the interview ends. Celine takes a deep breath, confirming it is over, and heads to the kitchen to make coffee. After she serves it, she has the most intimate and interesting conversation with my mother for around 2.5 hours. They cover almost all aspects of the Subhiyeh I was looking for. This experience with Celine also made me reflect upon how I use my lens both literally and metaphorically, as a photographer and a researcher, and the burden of pointing both lenses at my interviewee. This interview takes me back to my undergraduate thesis, when I tried and failed to interview my mother about her life story. Along the lines of that research study, I discovered that I should have a conversation with my mother, not force it. My mother played a crucial role in helping me gain access to the community. I left Aleppo when I was 17, not having the chance to take part in a Subhiyeh. She accompanied me on my journey from Yerevan to Aleppo. Before leaving for Aleppo, she started calling family and friends to let them know that we'd be visiting and that I'm doing research about Subhiyehs. The word spread fast, and in no time, she found more than enough people from our friends and family circles to talk to. Her approach to my research was guided by her own curiosity towards Subhiyehs because, as someone with a professional job, she didn't used to have them. I was trying to understand the community I grew up in, whereas my mother was trying to understand me. Soon after having a few Subhiyehs, the word spread fast in my community, and I was invited to more Subhiyehs. The community got involved and started a collective reflective process about the importance of Subhiyehs. Part of what helped me gain easier access to the community is that most of my interviewees were people I grew up with or around. Some of them remember me as a child, or they knew me through my mother. The word got out beyond the circles I was talking to, which led to brief impromptu conversations on the street with people who heard about my research. In many ways, they were brief, but very rich in content information, because these people had thought about these issues before meeting me. I embarked on this research remembering Jackson's words about how anthropologists can become possessive about their societies and try to indulge their knowledge of their society in their research. She also talks about how anthropologists are romantics at heart, especially when working with their own societies. Jackson's words were a constant reminder for me to avoid romanticizing my society, given that I write about a minority in Aleppo and focusing on a micro group of friends and family. I tried my best to leave my pre-constructed assumptions behind and to be a more attentive listener. The place, circumstances, and people I chose to work with are extremely vulnerable. I had subhiyahs with women in their 50s and 60s, most of whom are stay-at-home wives and mothers, in addition to women in their 20s who study and work in different fields. Working with women's life stories does not only deal with the connection between the social sphere and the self, it also focuses on how society shapes the collective representation of women's conditions, which then becomes an integral part of the interview. These are issues that come up in almost all subhiyahs and increasingly turn it into a vulnerable moment. To take up safety measures, I refrain from using any of my interviewees' real names, giving them pseudonyms instead. In many ways, I am both an insider and an outsider. Being from Aleppo, I am familiar with the subhiyah settings. The kinship I have with the women I talk to makes me very much an insider. At the same time, having lived outside of Aleppo for 10 years disconnects me from its reality. Especially its post-war reality, as I am not familiar with the everyday habits people had to adopt to survive. Stepping into my fieldwork, I sat with Ruth Bihar's words. I am here because I am a woman of the border. Between places, between identities, between languages, between cultures, between longing and illusions. One foot in the academy and one foot out. Facing survivor's guilt during my fieldwork didn't allow me to wear my emotions publicly and be vulnerable during conversations. Also, being fully aware of women's emotions, I did not want to open wounds I do not have power to heal. Even though the small act like paying the bill when meeting with younger women has good intentions, it can be perceived as belittling of their financial independence as working women, in addition to the connotations of my coming from a financially more stable country. So I avoided that as well, trying to bypass any scenario where this research becomes an anthropology that breaks your heart. I also had to assess my privileges of having the opportunity to be invited into those intimate, private spaces as a female researcher. Consequently, when oral history was harsh and introduced fear of facing a recorder, Subhiyeh became the method. Most of the women, especially the ones in their 50s and 60s, do not work or have financial independence. Their main way of socializing is to create gendered, women-only spaces in their buildings or neighborhoods. Inviting each other for coffee, a drink available... Inviting each other for coffee, a drink available at any household, helps women reclaim their place and create informal, safe spaces where they could share intimate lives and memories. In some cases, when the house is not safe enough, meaning children are in the house, the women are about to discuss private topics, the subhiyah moves from the living room to the kitchen table. The code phrase is, "Let us have our coffee in the kitchen, I need to start preparing lunch." The kitchen door is shut closed with the excuse that they do not want the smell of food to take over the house. During our conversation, Sandra, a woman in her late 20s, said, sorry, this slide is not helping me. I was always curious to know what my mother and her neighbors talked about. I would always sit with them. When the discussion got heated, my mother would ask me to leave the room and go play in my bedroom. There is also an opposite tactic when children are around and women want to talk about intimate issues. They would send their children to go make coffee and serve it. The act of making coffee in the kitchen, separated from the living room, would buy them enough time to talk about these issues. Topics of discussion are often around family affairs, financial troubles, or domestic violence. Their sexual lives, on the other hand, stay out of the conversation. Sex remains in the privacy of each woman's bedroom. I faced such a situation at one of the subhiyahs I was at with my mother. The woman hosting us asked me to go make coffee because she wanted to have a taste of my coffee. I headed to the kitchen and spent a good 15 minutes making the coffee. When I returned, they suddenly went silent and changed the topic. When we left, I asked my mother what they were talking about. She said our host was sharing graphic details about someone's death and they did not want to traumatize me. I was hesitant in most subhiyahs to initiate difficult conversations, especially conversations relating to war. I was also considering silences and how I would deal with them when they occur. To my surprise, there were no silences. Silences did not exist because people wanted to talk. They wanted to take the burden of these difficult experiences off their shoulders. Being in a politically censored setting meant that they cannot express themselves publicly. However, they could not keep their thoughts about the war to themselves. Then again, my outsider position helped. They needed fresh, war-free ears to listen to their stories. While I was concerned with ethical considerations, Talar, a woman in her mid-50s, broke my train of thoughts. She suddenly burst at me. Look around you, record things. Look at the way we are living. No one pays attention to our everyday routine, to our sensitivity towards everything. Write about them. Let the world know how we live. Talar's words were a wake-up call for me and a cry for help for her. In all subhiyahs, people talked about the war. They reflected on personal incidents. Vana, a woman in her late 50s, lives with her extended family. Their apartment is on the last floor of the building, which is one of the most dangerous places to live in. She told me how when ISIS was shelling the city, her neighbors took refuge in her house, instead of all of them moving to lower floors. She said, whenever the shelling would stop, all neighbors would come to our apartment. I would make more than 20 cups of coffee according to the number of people at the house. We would sit outside on our balcony, assess the damage, check if everyone is alive, then sip our coffees. In some cases, they would use the subhiyah to be together and try to break their fear and trauma through jokes and old memories. Claire, a woman in her early 50s, told me how when Aleppo was besieged, they had no access to food and resources. The subhiyah woman would assess what each household had and come up with new recipes using whatever they had in storage. They would also save some for the upcoming days to survive. Maybe these were not structured interviews or interviews at all. But if we look at them closely, they hold all the components of an oral history interview. Sharing authority between you and the person you're talking to gain access and hear their difficult stories. One thing that was clear for me and all my interviewees was when and where we would draw the line between what can and cannot be said. There were cases where I had to silence them, mute their voices, erase their stories, especially with intense political talk. Because that one moment of outburst could put them in grave danger if recorded. Almost all my interviewees valued their subhiyah time because this intimate space gives them a bit of freedom to offload, to share, to reflect, and to make their stories heard even by that one person who happens to be their neighbor. Coming together, such moments become crucial when people are facing systematic unequal distribution of economic, political, and cultural power. Maya best describes it as, in this country, we cannot go out on the street and protest for our basic rights to live decently. All we can do is sit down, have coffee, and collectively rant about electricity, water, inflation, and safety. The subhiyah is our only form of protest. During the first subhiyah in Aleppo, when Celine brought in the coffee, I took a picture. When we went back home, my mother pointed out the size of the coffee pot. She told me that if the coffee pot is big and full, it means each person gets 2 or more cups of coffee. But the deeper meaning behind it is that there is more gossip to be shared, so they need more than one cup to cover the scope of all topics they wanted to talk about. When I compare the recordings to the pictures I took, I can see that the shorter the recordings, the less coffee was consumed. Gossip has the lion's share in Subhiyehs, most of the time being the only activity. There are also clear sides as to who the gossiper and the person being gossiped about are. Every small to big detail in everyday life turns into a subject of discussion. The major themes change during different times of the year. Gossip analysis requires a deep understanding of social values, rules, and conflicts. Women used gossip as a tool to keep the togetherness of the community, to reroute their social and cultural belongingness to their communities. Gossip provided the closest aspect to a truth and a deeper insight beyond any theory I could find to describe Subhiyehs. Listening to gossip cycles helped me break down the stories and make sense of them. I came to better understand Kamanos, who, while listening to the women in her family gossip, states that there are stories inside stories and stories between stories, and finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. And part of the finding is the getting lost. And when you're lost, you start to look around and to listen. The younger women I talk to, who are considered a new generation compared to their mothers and grandmothers, all work. They are in various stages of their 20s. Some are studying at universities, some work, some of them are doing both, none of them staying home compared to the older generation. It is key to mention that this generation went through their teenagehood and transitioned into adulthood during the war. And so their life experiences are significantly different from their parents' experiences growing up in the same city. The Subhiyeh as a concept, managed to remain a part of their lives as well. Women in their 20s managed to take the Subhiyeh from the privacy of their living rooms and kitchens to public spaces like cafes, bars, or parks. While in Aleppo it is socially acceptable for women to be in public places, that visibility, however, depends very much on their family's mentality and financial ability. Almost everyone from the women I conversed with works, and they have some sort of financial independence that allows them to be in public places. In some cases, families set curfews, allowing them to be in public but with limitations. I had all my Subhiyahs with them in public places chosen by them. Because they work or study, the Subhiyah most of the time took place in the afternoon or even at night. My mom was not part of these Subhiyahs. Jessica, a young woman in her early 20s, stressed the importance of a Subhiyah to her, regardless of which time of the day it takes place. For her, it is an opportunity to be away from home, to rant, to meet with friends, sometimes even using it as a space to group study sessions. Jessica's Subhiyahs are women-only spaces. When I was talking to her, she said that our mothers do not always understand our problems, and home is not always a safe space to talk about our everyday lives. So we go out and spend a few hours after work to talk things out and then go home. The need for these spaces was clear in all conversations because even with the noticeable progress and the shift from private to public spaces, there are still social issues that have not necessarily changed. I had a couple of Subhiyahs where men were allowed into the conversation. This is a major leap from the older generation, where the mere existence of men in a different room in the house would have the Subhiyah postponed or cancelled. Of course, all young men are not allowed to join these Subhiyahs. There is an imaginary checklist where boxes should be checked for a man to be allowed into these spaces. He has to be progressive, understanding, empathetic, open to listen, and most importantly, non-sexist. This is largely due to young women taking up space in public places and making friendships beyond their buildings and neighborhoods. These women encourage discourse, feeling empowered to some degree as women to have their loud opinions shared among men. Men in this case blur the lines of sexism by sharing space with these women. Of course, this is not done in all settings where women publicly exist. This is only a niche part of the society that I was working with. Some taboo issues, especially political debate, still do not take place in public spaces. Everyone has their personal safety concern as the top priority, and they refrain from bringing these issues to light. Along with taboos, which can come up sometimes, women in public places carefully look around before talking. Whispering is another strategy to talk about these issues. These political conversations remain private and are discussed at subhiyahs that only take place at home. Nadine, a woman in her mid-20s, expressed how public subhiyahs are her own version of therapy. She tried to seek therapy both locally and internationally through online services, but nothing worked for her. She said, sorry, the slides are... We do not need Western ideas to get over our war-inherited PTSD and depression. We deal with our trauma through dancing, singing, music, and our subhiyahs. These are part of an existing system inherited from our parents' and grandparents' time. We rebuilt it for ourselves based on both our personal and cultural needs. Most of my friends are not happy with their therapists because they do not get them. We usually have a subhiyah and vent about our therapy sessions, and that is more therapeutic than the actual session. To write up a research study is to begin a process of conversation, research, and writing. It is simply about being with others. To me, this is essentially what the subhiyah creates, a space for research that does not seek to objectify, but rather makes human interactions extremely subjective due to the intimacies that they create, with coffee, with each other, and with mornings in general. The subhiyah as a gendered space manifests the close-knit communal aspect of these women. It carries on their soft power to influence domestic and social decisions. For example, by talking about taboos, advising on parenting, where to find the cheapest and best food ingredients, and so on, the subhiyah expands from being a therapeutic space to an environment of problem-solving and guidance. And once again, these women show their deep understanding of how to manage life, how to survive war, and how to stay sane. By including their children in the subhiyah, they indirectly pave the way for them to learn about life struggles. As such, they subvert the narrative that portrays them only in a submissive role. The insight gained through Claire's interview on how the subhiyah women shared resources during the war is a great example as to how women have managed to organize in a country where they cannot be political and have almost no public participation in its discourse. They have managed to turn the subhiyah into a safe space to protest, to pull resources together, creating a support network and influencing decisions. These women, in many ways, are political. Gossip in subhiyahs, on the other hand, is a double-edged sword of both entertainment and repression. In a way, it is used as a tool to entertain, to escape from the heavy burdens of war and the burdens imposed on these women by a patriarchal society. Discussing what others are doing, looking through images on social media, provides some sort of comic relief to these women. On the other hand, gossip reinforces being stuck in a hostile environment backed by heavy surveillance and judgment. In a society that forces women to act, talk, and dress a certain way, it becomes harder to break away from this vicious cycle by engaging in gossip all the time. Then again, in most cases, gossip still provides a great sense of belongingness to a community, even if deemed toxic in many ways. With the new generation, the subhiyah has been reconfigured into a new form. By pushing its boundaries from private to public, it has allowed the gradual inclusion of other groups like men into these spaces. The advancement of the digital age naturally has changed things, and the subhiyah is no exception. The older generation's interaction with the internet remains limited to various social media platforms. However, the younger generation is using the internet as a tool to escape reality, at the same time trying to learn how to live with it. The younger generation of women and men in Aleppo are a witness to that. That being said, the Subhiyeh has moved from being an unaware therapeutic practice into a more conscious awareness and discussion about mental health. This has helped the young generation of women to deconstruct the notions of why they are hurting. Thus, for some, the Subhiyeh became a more effective tool for therapy when real therapy fails, as expressed by Nadine. Decentering the world and taking up a step outside of academia and step into the local environment transforms knowledge into knowing and inquiry into life. The Subhiyahs ended with silences, an indication that we covered all there is to be covered. We were tired and we needed to leave the space to reflect. Borrowing from bell hooks, I came to theory because I was hurting. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, wanting to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. I was able to move from being an invisible, silent observer under the dining table to be around the table, visible, vocal, and included. Drinking coffee was not my rite of passage, the Subhiyahs were, in the sense that my place within these settings transformed. And so, the knowledge shared with me also changed and became much more intimate and much more dangerous. I had to escape theory to come back to it by using the space of the Subhiyah to understand the larger context of what it has to offer the women of Aleppo.
Thank you, Hudi. Thank you for this really beautiful rendering of a very, very important field work. The floor is open to questions now. Questions, comments to Hudi.
Yes, I can just ask.
It's also being recorded, so it would be better.
Hi, Hurijan. Thank you very much. This was very informative and emotional. My question regards to the names that you chose. Was the choosing of the new names random? Was there a pattern to it? Are some of the names Western, or did you stick to local names? Thank you.
Yeah, so if the name is Armenian, it means that the person that I talked to was Armenian. And with the Western names, usually because it's a kind of a post-colonial habit that most Christians in Aleppo have, is giving French names to their children. So that's why you can see names like Claire or Jessica, and things like that. Celine, no, Nadine is a very Arabic name. And then if the name is in Arabic, it means that that person had an Arabic name, and I just, talking to them, with most of them I asked them okay, what name would you like to have instead? And with some, they said that just put whatever you want. But yeah, there was a pattern as to if the name is Armenian, it means that the person's kind of ethnic belongingness is Armenian.
Zara and then Greg. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you can tell, if there are different topics, what specific topics were discussed, and was there a difference generational-wise, what topics were discussing different generations that you talked with?
Yeah, so, I mean, the topics were, like I said, seasonal. So when I went, it was wedding season in Aleppo, and the major topic of discussion during gossip was how much the wedding dress costs, what's the venue, how much it costs, and then of course, if the wedding had happened, then you have screenshots and videos from different social media platforms that they all have gathered somehow and they sit down and zoom in and out as to who was invited, who was not invited. They sometimes even assess how much money you have based on the wedding that you threw. These were the topics but these were mainly with the older generation. They also existed with the younger generation, but with the younger generation, it also, because I think mainly because of social media, it has changed to talking about, with some people I was talking about philosophy, different kinds of music and how it's affecting society, but gossip was there, and these kind of migrated to the younger generation, but they changed over the years with more topics being included.
I had to make you all go this way.
That's okay.
Beautiful piece. Thank you so much for sharing this with us all. My interest is in regards to mental health, obviously. I think when it comes to the idea of gossiping, or I shouldn't call it gossiping, but rather just that sense of creating your own little culture of getting together and talking and debriefing, if I may use that word. I guess I've got two questions. One, what are the parallels between what you experienced and what you shared in terms of Syria and potentially what is happening here in Armenia, especially with, I guess, our history of post-traumatic stress after earthquakes, wars, etc. And the second part of that question is, have you dabbled into how other cultures use pretty much the same template to also survive, to kind of debrief, as I said, and get through difficult scenarios together?
Yeah, thank you. These are very important questions. And actually some women, when I was talking to them, expressed that as well. About, one of them said, I had depression, but because I was coming to these coffee gatherings, somehow like it didn't completely go away, but the intensity of that depression became less because everyone was just laughing and sharing jokes or debriefing about their day. The parallels I drew is that in Armenia, I live in a building where it's mostly diasporans, mostly populated by Syrian Armenians, Lebanese Armenians, Kuwaiti Armenians. So that culture pretty much still exists in my building here in Yerevan. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't noticed that with other buildings in Yerevan where this gatherings in the same building happen on daily basis with women. I know Serjenk or Let's Go Have Coffee is the big thing, but it's usually done in public, not like in the same building. The cultures I kind of borrowed research from mainly was India to a big extent, and of course like I used a lot of research from Lebanon, from Palestine, from different countries that are neighboring to Syria, but because of the socioeconomic reasons, the Subhiyeh transforms into something else. But again, going back to the younger generation, because there's social media, they are trying to seek these platforms that provide mental health services, but because the cultural understanding is missing, it's somehow not working out for any one of them. I hope that answered all of your questions.
Thank you, Hori. Of course, amazing research. But my question, knowing where you come from and your capstone and the conversations we had, my question is centered around consent and how. And you mentioned it briefly, but I'm curious of how that worked out later. And also, quoting from Zara, I'm also curious about the generational difference around this question.
Yeah, I think even with my undergrad, and this is part of oral history where it's not, you don't go by the book all the time. And when written consent failed, I collected oral consent from all of my participants because I was recording the conversations. Some conversations were not recorded, but I still recorded an oral consent because you always need to have consent. The second part is that when I would go to, people, sorry for the ageism here, the older generation, they would also always tell me that, yeah, go write whatever you want, phrase it however you want, add what do you want to do with it, like we're fine, we don't care. But with the younger generation, when I would bring up the consent aspect of the conversation, they were very careful. Most of them like had very specific questions. Some of them like, okay, do not mention my name, or like, I do not want this to be published. I even had few people that asked me that to review their whatever I'm citing from their conversation. They wanted to read it before submitting my dissertation. So yeah, there was this very clear distinction between consent generationally, but for all of them it was mainly oral consent, no written consent. Even though I had like a 5-page consent form traveling with me, I never used it.
Thank you. Thank you, Uri. I should first say that I'm honestly very happy that an AUA student goes into anthropology. And I think I should also thank Uri and probably Melissa as well for that. I have 2 questions. First of all, very interesting research, and I hope you continue with it and with anthropology. But that's your choice, of course. So my 2 questions, okay, I'll come to
No
the questions.
pressure.
Yeah, no pressure at all. First is about, I'm very interested in the intergenerational comparative dimension, and in relation to the concept of Subhiyeh itself as a social institution, perhaps. Because when you speak of the new generation and their Subhiyahs, it turns out that most of the definitional characteristics of the Subhiyah are not there. Like, it's not in the Subhiyah, it's not in the morning, it's not just women, it's not in the private sphere. So what makes that still a Subhiyah is my question. Do they speak of it still as a Subhiyah? Is that how they name it? If it is, then how it is still different from other social gatherings, just any gathering? That's my first question. And second, could you say a bit more about the ethnic, religious, perhaps, dimension behind all this? It's interesting that you did not speak about it. That's also interesting. Why? But also, was there any difference when it comes to Armenians, Assyrians? Did you have any non-Christian? And even if not, maybe based on are there other researches about Muslims and their Subhiyahs? To what extent there are differences? How does all that come into, or might come into your into all this topic? Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. So I completely, your question is like a whole 2-page description in the research as to why is it's still called Subhiyeh. And I did ask this question to the younger, because when I told them I'm doing a research about Subhiyeh and I want to talk to you preferably in the morning, they were like, yeah, we'll meet 5 p.m. I'm like, but it's not a Subhiyeh. Like, no, it's still Subhiyeh. And then like, almost everyone I asked, the answer was, is that it has this specific type of intimacy that you create in a group, but because of time restraints, like because they're working, the Subhiyeh was created around women who are not working, they're in the same building, but because they managed to take this spatially from from private to public, but that need for them to sit down, to debrief, to talk about these issues became different. And we were actually talking about Hurik the other day, that like we were comparing Lebanon and Syria, and like she was asking me about the concept of Sahriye, which means like a night gathering where it's usually on rooftops or balconies or whatever, and even that is different between Lebanon and Syria and how it's done. But yeah, like for me as well, like I sat down with this question a lot. I'm like, okay, but this is not called a Subhiyeh at this point. It should be something else. But everyone insisted. They're like, yeah, come, let's have a Subhiyeh at 9. And they would still drink coffee. Like no one switched the drink to something else, apart from me, of course. But they would all still drink coffee. The second question about the ethnic and religious divide. So for me, I only had 15 days, and this was a very limited MA dissertation. And I didn't have time to go find new people to talk to, navigate the neighborhoods. And to have a Subhiyeh, you need to have some sort of intimacy and kinship with the people you're talking to. So what helped me is that I'm half Armenian, half Syriac, so I already had like access to like both, let's say, Armenian and Arab communities of different Christian sects. With the younger generation, religion was never an issue. Like the people I met with came from all backgrounds. It was very much mixed. With the older generation, it was mainly Christians of different denominations, whether it's Armenian or non-Armenian. But I would, like, if I want to talk about it in quantity, it was less Armenians in general during this research. Like, I would say 20-80 kind of thing, if I want to compare numbers. Mainly, strictly, I didn't choose this like, oh, I don't want to talk to Armenians. It was strictly given to what access I had and who could I talk and not talk to during these Subhiyehs.
Thank you, Huri. It's really nice to meet you. And thank you for this familiar and interesting fieldwork. So my question is very detailed. Have you perhaps noticed some cases where maybe younger girls or women, despite not liking the taste of coffee itself, because I mean it may happen, they made themselves to drink it or got used to drinking in order to integrate in the Subhiyeh culture, or to take the rite of a passage, kind of thing. Have you noticed such pattern?
In my case, I didn't come across anyone who didn't like coffee. It was only me, and they would call me a fraud or a scam for doing research about Subhiyehs and not drinking coffee. But yeah, like that conversation was just like a few seconds, and we would get past that fact real quick. But no one from the people that I met like mentioned that they do not like coffee, or they just, you know, try to have it just to be included in these spaces. I guess it just grows on you. I don't know. I tried, I failed.
Thank you, Huri, for this beautiful and curious research and presentation. My question is a follow-up on the just recent question, actually. It's a personal question. As a person who doesn't like coffee, what drew you, what attracted you to the research on Subhiyeh? What quality of the Subhiyeh as being away from the country and going back to the country? This also from gender perspective, it's a women's collective somehow. What drew you there?
Yeah, like I said, it was just this childhood curiosity. That's where it started. You know, I was always curious, like, why my grandma is only having, you know, her female neighbors around and no men were in these spaces. And then when we moved to Armenia, our building, like I mentioned before as well, is very much Syrian Armenians. And my mom, I've never had a Subhiyeh with my mom in Aleppo, but the first time we had a Subhiyeh was at our own place here in Yerevan, and like until this day, neighbors would come every morning and they would sit down. And I would never talk. I just listened for 10 years. I listened to these conversations. And if you study at any point, if you're a feminist, if you study gender theory, and if you know oral history and how subjectivity is important, then you just cannot unsee all of this.
I need to ask a question now. After all of this, and I think the way you beautifully kind of brought this back also to your mother, I need to ask this question that has been lingering in my head ever since you did your capstone, actually undergraduate capstone, where you also worked with your mom, but in that case, your mother was a participant. So she was the researched, you were the researcher, and now she's your interlocutor. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and what it meant for you in terms of affect as well, and the important place affect has in your research, but also literally on the ground, having her in the major part of the Subhiyehs, and then how you also underlined the fact that she was not there for the younger generations.
Yeah, you can, she's here, so you can ask her these questions.
Kautar, you as well, if you want to kind of pitch in. It's like
Yeah, I think with the undergraduate, we also took this journey from Yerevan to Aleppo. It was a completely different topic, but I think that also prepared my mom to be part of this second research. And I remember, like, I was still in London, and I called her. I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna do my thesis about Subhiyeh, and I think we need to go to Aleppo. And she said, yeah, let's go. Like, no questions asked. And you know, she was like my personal assistant, where she called everyone, she chose the dates. My dad organized, like, it was a family thing. My dad organized the flight, and then we go there. She had a schedule, like, okay, today morning we're seeing this person, and then in the afternoon we're meeting this person and that person, and then at night you go do whatever you want. And then the next morning, because people who know me know that I never in my life would wake up at 8 a.m. So I did that because she would wake me up, drag me to breakfast at the hotel, and then we would, you know, go from one house to the other. But it didn't end there. Like, I think for her as well, she gained that sense of what I'm working with, and she started to give me notes. Oh, pay attention to what this person said. Oh, you know what? Also, even today we were at the kitchen and she was still processing all of this with me. And even after when we came back to Yerevan, I went back to London to complete my thesis writing. She was always there during this reflective process, which also tells you, like, coming from feminist theory, you also understand that you don't always find, in academia, you don't always find that one theory that you need to put in your bibliography to get an A. Then a lot of, like, black women feminist researchers tell you that how they come up with a theory as they go, how you theorize in your everyday life to make that theory happen. You don't always need to focus on a theory that already existed a billion years ago that was written by a white man who doesn't understand anything about these settings. So my mom was that person for me, and I guess for her as well. Like, she had her, today she was telling me that she had her subhiyahs at work, and my mom loves coffee. Yeah. The apple does fall far away from the tree sometimes. She loves coffee, and she said that only in Armenia now she's having the coffee in the morning at home. In Aleppo, she would never have coffee because in the morning all of us are gone, and then she would go to work and have her first cup of coffee with her colleagues at the workspace. So maybe I lied. She did have subhiyahs, but in a very completely different setting. So I hope that answered the question.
I'm not pressuring you, Kautar, but anything you may want to add would be.
Huri doesn't drink coffee, but when she wants to talk with me, when she has a time to talk with me, she told me, Mama, do you want to drink coffee? I will prepare it. And she make a great coffee.
Arthur.
Thanks a lot. That was so lovely. My question is the following. So you said that with later generations, and correct me if I'm recalling this wrong, you said with later generations, men, specific type of men who met a certain criteria were able to join this conversation, this discourse. What do you think was the factor that influenced this switching point for men to be part of this awesome thing?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and that's a part that I could not include in my research, because the men that I talked to were mostly queer. So the fact that they are queer gave them easier access to subhiyahs, and but I couldn't use any of their stories because in the setting that I worked with, they could easily be tracked down given social media and technology today, and these stories could have been weaponized against them, and I would basically put them out. But but yeah, I think with my Subhiyahs that I had with the younger generation, it was mostly with queer young men who were part of these Subhiyahs. And I would say a few straight men were part of the younger generation Subhiyahs. And also it was this curiosity towards, again, comes with the internet, comes with social media. When I was writing my thesis, like, these men were leading a sexual harassment case against one of a school teacher. It was a 10-year-old case. It just brought up to light, but it was mostly led by men. The conversation led by the same men I was talking to during these Subhiyahs. So I guess social media and being exposed to more things definitely has changed that mentality, and it is changing as we go.
So I've got another question. So based on the previous question then, do you think that the Subhiyah is primarily founded on the inability of people who lack true voice, and or there is an element of suppression? And I guess to kind of conclude with that question as well, if there is a time period or a community where that lack of suppression is broken, and or that lack of true voice, or they're allowed to have a voice, do you think the Subhiyah then will be watered down and possibly disappear?
I'm not sure about it being disappearing, unless hopefully these issues disappear with it. But yeah, it is very much like, that's why like the inclusion of men was them being queer and then subjected to suppression by society as well. Because I was living in London as well, and I've never seen like anything close to a Subhiyah in London, even though there's still suppression everywhere around the world. But yeah, you're very much right. Like, wherever there's suppression, then there's the Subhiyah. But it being watering down, I don't think that's gonna happen, because even now at our building, like, sometimes we do have Subhiyahs where my dad and our other neighbors' husbands are included. So maybe that would change to being more inclusive, but I guess, like, sadly, as a culture, we're still facing atrocities from all aspects, be it war, be it domestic violence, be it other social issues or political or economical. So as long as we have these topics to talk about, then the Subhiyah would never die, I guess.
Is there also the practice of reading the future in the cup of coffee?
Yeah, that's there in some, but it's not something that they did, it's not an everyday activity where they all gather and they're like, okay, let me read your coffee cup. They do it every now and then, more with the older generation, because they claim that they've kind of inherited this and they never taught it to the younger generation. So I didn't face it with the younger generation. With the older generation, maybe at one of the Subhiyahs there was coffee cup reading, but it's there, but it's not like the number one activity that happens.
Any other questions? Huri, thank you again. Our conversations. Our conversations will continue now with some wine, and you can still talk to Huri over there. And I just wanted to again remind you that we will restart the series back again in the fall, in the next academic year, hopefully with many new stories to come. And the whole idea behind organizing this series was to be able to create a more intimate space where we could bring alumni, students, and faculty together, not only to hear about the stories of our alumni and what they have researched, where they have gone, what they have made of themselves beyond the campus, but also to let our students, our current students, think about what is for them beyond the campus as well. So we hope to be able to continue these riveting conversations in the fall. For now, the conversations and stories will continue without coffee, but with wine over there. Thank you so much.